Now that we are sending tokens to the client and we can protect endpoints with the security middleware, it's actually time to implement the core logic that powers our routes and models. So we're going to start with the post request to the posts endpoint. That's kind of confusing. But when I'm referring, kind of like saying post twice, I'm referring to the post request here to the /posts endpoint, which we're going to set up in a second. Actually, let's go ahead and do that first. Since we're exporting this router here, we want to import those routes as well. We want to say const post routes equals require ./routes /posts. Now let's add them here. We'll say app.use the posts routes, and we'll use the post routes. It's tough to say too. Now let's go ahead and npm start. Make sure everything is working all right. Looks good. Now that we have our post routes set up, we're going to look at the post request to the /posts endpoint, which is going to be used to create a new post. Probably should name that differently now thinking about it, but it is what it is. Now, this handler is going to call the create new post method here on the post model. So it's going to need a post and a user. Now, once we realize that this route is expecting user, that should tell us that we need to protect it from unauthenticated requests. Because if a user doesn't exist, things are going to go horribly wrong. So let's actually make sure that we protect this route here, this post route, from unauthenticated requests. And to do that, we'll need to do two things. First, let's import the model. Then, let's import the security middleware. Now, once we have that in place, let's go ahead and include the security middleware to require an authenticated user on this endpoint. And knowing that, we can simply extract the user from res.locals because we know they'll exist there. Then we can create a new post. Yes, with the user, and the post should be whatever is passed in request.body. Then we will return res.status 201 to say something was created, and JSON with the newly created post. So nothing crazy here, just another route, but the cool part is we have a user, and that's exactly what we want at the end of the day. So now we're dealing with user-owned resources. Great. Let's actually head into the model, and let's implement this create new post method. Now, a few things here. We're going to probably have to come back to this and maybe look at it a couple times, but let's import some errors first because there are definitely some things that could go wrong here. Let's say bad request error, not found error equals require ... /utils /errors. And then in this method, we're going to make sure some required fields are passed in. The caption field and the image URL field, because those are required in the database. And then we're going to say required fields dot for each field. And we're going to run a function. And we're going to say if not post dot has own property field, we're going to throw a new bad request error that is going to say required field, and then we'll just interpolate in that field missing from request body. Now we should probably actually create a utility function to handle all this validation and verification for us, but we're going to leave it what it is for now. The other thing we have to do is we have to make sure that post.caption isn't longer than 140 characters. Otherwise, we need to throw a new bad request error there as well. And we can say, for this one, we can just say post caption must be 140 characters or less. Cool. Now, if everything goes right, then we can finally run our SQL. And in this case, we want to insert a new record into the posts table. And we want to insert the caption, the image URL, and the user who is creating it. To do that, we will pass in the first value, which will be the caption, the second value, which will be the image URL, and both those exist on the post. And now this one's going to be a little interesting. Remember that we're only encoding in this token, we're only encoding the user's email. So we don't actually have the user's ID here, because when we decode that token, only the email is present. So we need a way of getting the user's ID from their email. To do that, we're going to implement a subquery, which will select ID from users where email equals 3. Returning ID, caption, image URL as image URL, user ID as user ID, and created at as created at. Let's also include updated at as updated at. Cool. Now we want to pass in a few bound parameters here. We want to pass in the post.caption, post.image URL, and user.email. Then we want to return results.rows. So a few things in the SQL. Again, the way we handle bound parameters with the PG SQL package is that this $ corresponds to this first argument in the array. So $1 is post caption, which we're inserting into caption. $2 is post.image URL, which we're inserting into the image URL column. And then we use a subquery to select the user's ID from the users table where the email is the user.email. And that is because we need the user's ID. Now, this was actually intentional. It was an intentional decision, so we can see the usefulness of subqueries and kind of understand some of the drawbacks of not using the primary key of the table in your JWTs. But sometimes it actually is a good idea. In fact, we probably do, the way we did this, we don't actually want to include a user's email in the JWT since we didn't encrypt that token. We just encoded it. A better approach might be requiring users to sign up with a unique username, which we deleted and had some problems with earlier, but literally just to show this, and having that username be the primary key of the users table instead. Then we can just send the username around, which is way less sensitive if someone nefarious were to get a hold of the user's token. And we'll see an example of that later on, but for now, just know that storing sensitive data in a JWT is not always the best approach, but you have to balance that with the fact that when you write your SQL queries, you're only going to have access to whatever you encode in the payload of the JWT. So just think about that. It's a trade-off. Now, once we have this done, we can actually test this out. So why don't we just create some posts, make sure it works. Let's save this. Make sure everything seems to be working as expected. Maybe I have some typos in here. We'll find out pretty soon. Let's create a new, well, before we do that, let's go to unsplash.com and get an image URL of a workstation we want to use. Let's do this one. This looks good. I'm going to open this in a new tab, and I'm going to grab this URL here. Then I'm going to take this image URL, and I'm going to pass it to Insomnia when we send a post request to the /posts route. Now here we are already authenticated as person@person.person, and we're using their auth token. So when we send this over, caption and image URL, this should recognize that the user is person@person.person and insert that record into the database. My new workstation. Send. Ooh, look, everything worked as we expected to. We have a new post inserted into the database with an ID, a caption, image URL, user ID of the user who posted it, created at, updated at. Fantastic. That looks really good. Let's actually register with another user and do the same thing just to be sure it works like we want it to. Let's say auth register, and we'll say email equals them@them.us, and the password is PW. Just to make this really easy. We will send that. Signed up. Good. Let's take their token here. And I'm going to go into the header, and I'm going to say authorization. bearer, and then pass that token in there. And I'm going to turn this one off and keep this one on. And then I'm going to send another post request to posts with some new JSON. We'll say caption suite setup. And then the image URL, we will grab another one from Unsplash. So let's try another fancy one here. Ooh, that's pretty fancy. That's also pretty fancy. Lots of good ones. Let's look for one that's, oh, that's absurdly fancy. Let's do that. Let's take this, use that in our image URL, and send. Great. So notice that it's a different user ID number 2 and ID 2. So 2 different users have submitted post requests to this route. It identified exactly who they were based on what token exists in the authorization header and inserted them into our database. Now, let's test that out by implementing our GET requests and making sure we can get all of those posts from our database. So let's start with the posts routes in here. So now that we've covered how to do this, the rest of this should be simple enough, as both of these do not need to be authenticated. They're public routes, so they're pretty straightforward. All we need to do is say const posts equals await post.list posts, and then return res.status 200.json posts. And then down here, we'll say const post ID equals rec.params, because we're extracting that post ID from the params of the endpoint, the request params. Then we'll say const post equals await post.fetch post by ID, and we'll pass in that post ID. Then we'll return res.status 200.json post. So now let's actually go ahead and implement the fetch post by ID and list post methods. Now again, these ones too, we're probably gonna have to come back to these in a little bit, but for the time being, let's do like a straightforward, simple version of them. So for this one, all we need to do is get the results of awaiting a DB query, where we select the, let's say posts, let's say p.id from posts as p, order by p.created at descending. Cool. So we also want to extract the caption and the image URL as image URL. Now, I didn't actually go over this, but notice that I'm surrounding these aliases with double quotes here. That's actually because the PG package that we're using to interface with Postgres doesn't work with case-sensitive aliases unless you surround it with double quotes. So that's the only reason I'm doing that. Otherwise, like if you were doing this right here, you could just say as caption. That would be totally fine. But we're surrounding it with double quotes mainly because of the way that this PG node package works. We also want to get the user ID as user ID, and we want to get the created at as created at. Also, we want to get p.updated at as updated at. Cool. Now, the other thing is, like, there's not a really good way to identify the user here. So let's actually join this table with the users table as u on u.id equals p.userid. So whatever user created this post, we're going to join that user to each of these posts. And then all we'll do is we'll extract out their email as user email. Like that. And that's it. Then we can just return results.rows. Let's see if it works. Might have messed something up there, but worth a shot, right? We need to turn this into a GET request. Doesn't matter what we put here, and we send. Amazing. Now we have a list of posts in descending order from when they were created. So the second post is first, which is exactly how a feed works. And this is what that's going to be used for anyway. So that's perfect. Now this fetch post by ID function is almost identical to this list post function, but we want to filter it to only a single post. So let's actually just copy this here. And then let's update it just a tiny bit. Instead of ordering, because we don't actually care about the order, we're just going to say where p.id, oops, not pd.id, p.id is equal to $1. And then we'll pass in the post ID. So we're just filtering it to only the post with the ID of whatever's passed in. And then we'll say const post equals results rows, the first row. And if that post doesn't exist, let's throw a new not found error. Otherwise, we'll just return the post. And then let's save that and make sure it works. So we have an ID of 2, an ID of 1. Let's make sure that if we give it a wrong ID, not found, great. If we give it a right ID, oh, I messed something up. Okay, let's check it out. Invalid input syntax for type integer. That looks very wrong. Okay, let's see what I did here. Okay, cool. I'm glad I have this logging here because that's a pretty nice error. I went for posts 2. Oh, I actually did it here. So that was not what I wanted. That was just an insomnia error. Post 2. Let's try that again. Okay, cool. Well, that's good to know. I should probably validate that the parameter passed in is a number, but we can do that later. The good news is that it worked. We can get a single post by ID and we can list all the posts, which is exactly what we want. So at this point, we're pretty much ready to go. We have it all set up. Things are working like expected. Now, we probably should think about the fact that we want to probably include the ratings, any ratings for each post here, but we'll get back to that when we've actually done the ratings work. For the time being, let's commit our work to Git. Git status, git add, git commit, implemented route post, and get endpoints. And we're good to go.